In 1974, John Carpenter burst onto the scene with his debut film, Dark Star. Dark Star was originally a student film that Carpenter expanded into a full feature with his friend and co-writer Dan O'Bannon. Early reviews were bad, and the film went on to be a box office failure. After Dark Star, Carpenter wrote 2 scripts, an action crime thriller called Assault on Precinct 13, and a dramatic thriller simply called Eyes. Both films were going to be extremely low budget and were scheduled to be directed by Carpenter. Jack H. Harris, who produced Dark Star, optioned the rights to Carpenter's Eyes script and was going to make it as a low-budget independent film. During this time, John Peters was getting into the industry. Peters was a hairdresser at a salon on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, California, where he was known as the hairdresser of the stars. Over the years, he was pulling in millions in salon merchandise and learned much about Hollywood by chatting to his customers. In 1975, the film Shampoo was released. The lead character was based on a combination of 2 famous hairdressers, Jay Sebring and John Peters. The sets were even designed to look like Peters' Beverly Hills salon. Peters had numerous high-profile clients, one of which was singer and actress Barbra Streisand. The two started dating in the mid-70s, and shortly thereafter, he left the salon to become her manager. After producing her album Butterfly, he presented Streisand with the film A Star is Born, which was a remake of the original from 1937. He produced the film, which went on to be the 3rd highest-grossing film of the year. It then won an Oscar for Best Original Song, as well as numerous Golden Globes, including Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Original Score, and Best Picture. Peters met with his friend Jack Harris, who let him read the script for Eyes. Peters liked it so much he wanted to take the script and make it as a big-budget studio picture starring Barbra Streisand. Peters showed the script to Peter Guber at Columbia, who signed on to finance the production. He was able to get Columbia to pay Carpenter $20,000 for his script. Peters then began to work with Carpenter and rewrote the script, tailoring it for Barbra Streisand. Peters wanted the film to be more of a romantic thriller instead of a horror thriller. Carpenter was originally slated to direct, but wasn't happy with the new direction of the film, so he left to work on Assault on Precinct 13. With Carpenter out of the picture, Peters ordered more rewrites of the film. Over time, at least 9 different writers worked on it. Streisand recorded the song Prisoner, which would be featured heavily in the film as the lead song on the soundtrack. With the new script, Streisand wasn't happy and left the film. She felt the new direction was too lurid and wasn't interested in being in that kind of film. Now with Streisand out, the studio insisted the film be rewritten without her in mind. For this job, they brought in David Zelig Goodman, who previously wrote Straw Dogs and Logan's Run. Now with the script, they needed a director. The few they presented it to weren't interested. They sent a copy to Irvin Kershner, who immediately said no. Kershner was a well-established director who'd been working in the industry since the 50s. He was also a tutor at USC, and was on the panel that awarded George Lucas a prize for his short film, Electronic Labyrinth THX 11384EB, in 1967. After Kershner passed on it, they tried other directors, but had little to no luck. They offered it to Lindsay Anderson, who called the script an absolute load of balls. They hired Michael Miller to direct, but he left shortly thereafter due to artistic differences. Meanwhile, without a director, they started looking into casting the lead. On the shortlist, they had Jane Fonda, Goldie Hawn, Catherine Deneuve, and Diane Keaton, but ended up going with Faye Dunaway. Dunaway had just won an Oscar for Best Actress in Network, and that would bring a lot of heat to the production. Peters worked hard to convince Dunaway to be in the film. It was not a safe choice, and initially, she wasn't completely on board. Now with Dunaway in the cast, Peters offered the film to Kershner again. This time, he agreed to direct, as long as he could make some changes to the script. Kershner said the original script was a trick, and he didn't want that trick. He wanted to use the film to send a message about the fashion industry. He had begun researching fashion photography, and decided at the time it was all about violence. He wanted to make the film a metaphor for what fashion does to women. He felt that fashion was forcing women into a narrow view of what beauty was. The script now barely resembled what Carpenter had originally written. The first thing was that they moved locations. Carpenter's script was in LA, but now it was in New York. They also changed the killer. In the original, he was just a faceless person from Skid Row. We don't know his name or his motives. Carpenter said, "What's scary is something that's random, that's unknown. The unknown killer that walks up and kills you for no reason is utterly terrifying because you're defenseless against it." Kershner said the original script had no resonance and was just a plain thriller. His version was something more, something that people would be talking about. He said, "Movies have a longer life if they're about something." Carpenter said the whole thing wasn't a pleasant experience. "The original script was very good, I thought, but it got shat upon." Kershner felt the original script was all about shock, and his version added more suspense. He inserted lots of red herrings and twists in the film until the ultimate reveal at the end, which led to a major problem: the ending. They had no idea how to end the film or who the killer would be. They figured this would be a minor problem that would be resolved before filming. At some point, the script was changed from Eyes to Eyes of Laura Mars. Now that things are moving along, they got the rest of the cast. They hired Tommy Lee Jones to play the police detective John Neville. He was a relative newcomer to the industry at the time, doing mostly small parts in TV shows and exploitation movies like Jackson County Jail. Brad Dourif was hired to play the driver Tommy Ludlow. Dourif was also new to the industry, with his first film being an uncredited role in the 1975 comedy W.W. and the Dixie Dance Kings. Although his second film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, landed him an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. René Auberjonois was brought in as Donald Phelps. He'd been making movies since the 1960s, but his breakout was as Father John in 1970's MASH. Kershner was filming in the building that Raul Julia lived in. He saw him in the Broadway play A Cherry Orchard and was very impressed. When he found out he was in the building, he asked him if he wanted to be in the movie. He was then hired to play the part of Michael, Laura Mars's ex. They hired 2 real models for the film, Darlene Flugel and Lisa Taylor, and this was the first movie for both of them. One of the reasons the movie's location was moved from LA to New York was because of the grittiness of New York at the time. In 1975, the murder rate in New York had risen to an all-time high. The city was going bankrupt, and there was the looming threat of laying off over 50,000 city workers. The Policemen's Benevolent Association started handing out leaflets to tourists calling New York Fear City and warned them to stay off the streets after 6 p.m. The leaflets had a few other warnings on how not to wind up getting mugged or worse. They liked the rawness of the city and thought it made for a better backdrop to the film. Production started in October of 1977. The film was mostly shot in New York and New Jersey on a budget of around $7 million. The movie was about a high-profile fashion photographer who sees these violent images she uses for her photo shoots. She later starts to have moments of temporary blindness, where she can only see through the eyes of a killer as he's murdering someone. The movie was rushed into production because the studio wanted it in theaters for the summer of 1978. When they started filming, they still didn't have an ending. To help with that, Kershner hired Julian Barry, who wrote Lenny. He wanted Barry to give the film more heart, so he continued to write the film as they were shooting it. Kershner didn't bother storyboarding and had the cast improvise their dialogue for some scenes. While there are some sets, they tried to shoot as much as they could on location to capture the seedy nature of 1970s New York. They filmed a scene of a fashion shoot in Columbus Circle. The shoot closed down the area for 4 days. Kershner enjoyed shooting in New York. With the narrow streets and dirty locations, made the whole thing feel claustrophobic. He also stated it was helping to show how isolated Laura Mars was becoming. In keeping with his message, Kershner didn't want the film to be too gratuitous, so he refused to show the kills. The audience would see from the killer and Laura Mars's perspective, but we never got any clear views of the murders taking place. It would all be heavily implied, and then we would get glimpses of the aftermath. The bizarre erotic photos in the film were inspired by the provocative German-Australian photographer Helmut Newton. He was hired to do some of the photos for the film, but the majority were done by Rebecca Blake, a very in-demand photographer working for companies like Estee Lauder and Revlon. When they hired her, they expressed that they wanted her to photograph murders like fashion advertisements. The scene in Central Park was almost completely improvised. Tommy Lee Jones was a football player when he was at Harvard, and he cleared this fence on the first try. Kershner also complimented just how fast he could run. Part of the way through filming, things started to go bad. Tempers exploded on set. It was well reported that producer John Peters and Faye Dunaway did not get along. There were also rumors that Kershner and Peters frequently butted heads. Kershner was trying to deliver a message with the film about how the latest trend of sexualized violence was damaging to both genders. This was at odds with what Peters wanted. In an interview, he said, "Modern consumerism tends to push you into a state of gracelessness. If you're short or aging or your hair's wrong, which does not mean we're delivering a message. We're telling a story that's romantic as well as enticing, but primarily a melodrama with a psychic aspect." Towards the end of filming, they decided to make the killer John Neville, which to them made the most sense. Tommy Lee Jones ended up writing and performing the monologue at the end, where he reveals he has a split personality. Who is the real killer? John and Laura are unknowingly drawn together because of this connection. This also worked because Peters kept insisting the killer be someone who Laura Mars could love. In the end, John wants Laura to kill the other person inside of him because he loves her and he knows the other personality will ultimately kill her. Kershner was overjoyed with the ending because it was a tragic tale of a woman finding a man to love but has to kill him. Peters kept the production a secret. He threatened to fire anyone who leaked any information about the ending. The whole shoot took about 56 days. Kershner said this was one of the most difficult stories to tell and the hardest to film. After assembling the rough cut, Kershner wasn't happy with the opening. He went back and changed it to a still frame of Faye Dunaway that focused on her eyes and slowly zoomed out to her face. George Lucas saw a rough cut of Eyes of Laura Mars and was so impressed he asked Irvin Kershner if he would direct the second Star Wars film, The Empire Strikes Back. After filming, Peters started a huge $7 million marketing campaign, effectively doubling the cost of the film. One of the biggest elements of that was a billboard that was repainted over several weeks to slowly reveal Faye Dunaway's face. Eyes of Laura Mars was released on August 2nd, 1978, and majorly underperformed. It made roughly $20 million on its theatrical run. Critics were mixed on the film. Roger Ebert trashed it, giving it 1.5 stars, calling it yet another women in trouble picture. You see them mostly on TV. A woman is chased by a hostile semi-trailer truck, or haunted by the ghost of her late lover, or kidnapped by terrorists. Laura Mars is nothing if she's not a woman in trouble. The New York Times said it had superlative casting, and noted the spectacular settings that turned New York into the kind of eerie, lavish dreamland. Despite Kershner's insistence that the film not be gratuitous, it was still accused of it anyway. Richard Combs of the Monthly Film Bulletin accused the film of exploiting the slick peddling of sex and violence. Roger Ebert said, Eyes of Laura Mars tries to say serious things about fashion photography, corruption in advertising, and the violence in our society. It does not succeed, but it tries. While Kershner called the original script a trick, that was what some of the critics called his film. They said the twist was dumb and a bad trick he played on the audience. The soundtrack to the film also flopped, with Streisand's song Prisoner hitting a high of 21 on the music charts 6 weeks after the film opened. 2 months later, on a $300,000 budget, John Carpenter's Halloween is released and is both a critical and financial success. Carpenter disowned Eyes of Laura Mars, but with his success on Halloween, the studio tried to plaster his name on the production as a way to boost foreign sales. While the movie did poorly upon its release, it was a hit on home video. In the years that followed, the movie found its way into pop culture. On the album Scarlet's Walk by Tori Amos is a song that was partially inspired by Eyes of Laura Mars called Gold Dust.
You can see in the dark through the eyes of Laura Mars.
The film's also been referenced in everything from Malcolm in the Middle to Billions. The Eyes of Laura Mars was often referred to as a disco giallo, an Americanized version of the genre that had been flourishing in Italy. It does share some similarities, although it's unknown if they were in the original script. Eyes are a recurring theme in giallo. Cold Eyes of Fear, Evil Eye, Eye in the Labyrinth, and many others. There were numerous giallo films that had POV shots as well. Kershner did indeed follow this up with The Empire Strikes Back, and despite directing one of the biggest sci-fi films of all time, he only directed a few more times after that. He directed Never Say Never Again and RoboCop 2, as well as the pilot episode of Sequest DSV. He then retired from the industry in 1993. Sadly, he died of lung cancer in 2010. In 1980, Peters teamed with record executive Peter Guber to form Polygram Productions, which was later renamed the Boardwalk Company, and later transformed into Guber Peters in 1983. In the mid-80s, Peters and Streisand ended their long-term relationship. Peters moved on to become a hit factory, producing films like Caddyshack, The Main Event, Flashdance, An American Werewolf in London, The Color Purple, The Witches of Eastwick, Inner Space, Rain Man, and the highest-grossing film of 1989, Batman. The film was such a hit they were offered a 7-year multi-million-dollar deal from Warner Brothers. Just a few months after the Warner Brothers deal, they left to become the chief executives of Sony Pictures Entertainment for the tidy sum of $1 billion. The exploits of the duo were recorded in the book Hit and Run, How John Peters and Peter Guber Took Sony for a Ride in Hollywood. Wanting to do for Superman what he did with Batman, Peters bought the rights to the character from Warner Brothers. There's a wonderful story in An Evening with Kevin Smith where he talks about how he was hired to write the script for Superman Reborn, in which Peters had all sorts of outlandish demands. Superman wasn't allowed to be in his classic costume, he couldn't fly, and he insisted the character fight polar bears and a giant mechanical spider. As Smith mentioned, the Superman movie was never made, but Peters did produce Wild Wild West, which included, this thing. In 2011, Peters was sued for sexual harassment and creating a hostile work environment for the 2006 film Superman Returns. This ended his career for quite some time. He was an executive producer on Man of Steel, but was banned from the set by producer Christopher Nolan. In a 2017 interview, Peters claimed to be the Trump of Hollywood. He was returning to the industry and promised another remake of A Star is Born would reignite his career. The 2018 remake of A Star is Born was released, and much like his version back in the 70s, it went on to win an Oscar for Best Original Song. The film grossed over $434 million worldwide on a $36 million budget. While this was a big hit both critically and financially, it's unclear if this is going to reignite Peters' career. Eyes of Laura Mars has gone through an immense amount of changes since it was first conceived. While I enjoy the film for what it is, I'd love to see John Carpenter's original script be made into a movie, although the whole process likely worked in his favor. Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13 were both financial flops, and the money he got selling off Eyes likely helped to keep him afloat until he made Halloween. So while it may have been rough at the time to see his vision altered, in the long run it ended up being for the best. It's also possible that if Carpenter didn't sell it and let it be changed, Irvin Kershner would have never made it, and by proxy wouldn't have ended up directing one of the greatest science fiction movies of all time. Eyes of Laura Mars is flawed but still a unique take on the American Giallo. While Kershner is a talented director, I don't know if he was really the best choice. The end result was a solidly entertaining thriller, but as others have said, this script with a director like Brian De Palma behind it would have most likely created a superior film. The film's a complex mess of ideas compounded by numerous writers and the conflicting visions of Kershner and Peters. Still, I enjoy it for what it is rather than lament what it could have been. The cast is terrific, and while the twist ending is fairly obvious, it doesn't detract enough to ruin the film. This is one of those movies where it's the journey, not the destination. Everything leading up to the end is good, it's just the finale is somewhat fumbled. Perhaps if there was a clearer vision early on, it may have helped, but we'll never know. In the end, it was a well-crafted thriller that could have been a complete disaster if it wasn't for the talent of the people involved.
Could I steer you away for a moment? Are you her?
Her stuff is really disgraceful, don't you think?